The debate over criminal justice reform is hitting closer to home thanks to a new report on the geography of incarceration. By mapping the neighborhoods most likely to have people in prison or jail, the report makes it easier to see an overlap with persistent poverty and underperforming schools. The report was done by the Boston Indicators Project in partnership with MassINC and the Massachusetts Criminal Justice Reform Coalition. We'd like to welcome as our guest from MassINC, the research director, Ben Forman. Thank you very much for being with us, Ben.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. We always appreciate you taking the time to read our research and bring us in to talk about it with you.
First of all, we talk about incarceration. We've heard a lot lately about reforms to maybe reduce that, and yet how does Massachusetts shape up compared with other states?
Well, Massachusetts, like most states around the country, is in the midst of a process to look at all aspects of the criminal justice system and see if we can do better. I think we've learned over the past 2 or 3 decades that getting tough on crime in every instance doesn't make us as safe as possible. It's very expensive. It has huge costs on families and particularly on communities that are affected by it. So the governor, the speaker, the Senate president, they're leading an effort to look carefully at our criminal justice system and see are there ways that we can do better.
Well, talk about the neighborhoods here, because you have one map. It's a recent year when people were incarcerated either in the Suffolk County House of Correction or at the jail. Just talk about what that looks like as a picture.
Well, when you look at these maps of the city of Boston, you can see that in some communities there's not a whole lot of incarceration, but in the city's communities of color, incarceration is very common. And there's a lot of research that says the more common we make incarceration, the least effective it is. If it becomes normal to go to prison, if your father's been to prison, if your grandfather's been to prison, you're probably not scared off by the threat of incarceration. So we dilute the power of that tool to help keep people safe. And it's clear that many of the city's communities of color have passed a threshold where incarceration is no longer as helpful.
Well, the racial disparity, it's clearest in that map about people returning from either prisons or House of Correction, and you clearly shade in, which races are most at play in this, because it's mostly Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. Now, a lot of people might say, well, maybe they expected that, but why is it important to put that on the map the way you did?
Well, I think, first and foremost, we want all of our citizens, regardless of their race, to have confidence in our justice system. If they don't think it's fair and effective, it's not going to keep them safe. And, there's been a lot of concern about, is there racial bias in our correction system? I think you had us in to talk about a report we put out last year that looked at racial disparities in bail. And we were seeing, if you're white, you pay one amount for bail, and if you're a different color, you pay a much higher amount for bail. When you see data like that, they don't prove that they're the result of biased decision making, but they're certainly consistent with that, and I think we got to dig deeper.
Well, you looked also at even areas within that map where things seem to be worse. Franklin Field, for instance, you have a lot of people that had the highest rate of incarceration in the city.
Yeah, I mean, we just encourage people to look at these maps, because all you have to do is look at the maps to get the understanding that what we're doing right now needs to change. And when you look at a street and you see every other house has a person who's been incarcerated in just the last few years, you can tell that, maybe that approach isn't solving the problem in that community. When we know about all the lasting effects incarceration has, not just on the individual who was sent to prison and their ability to ever get a good job again, but on their kids, on their spouses. There's a lot of things that we could do differently, and I think these data invite us to have a conversation about those approaches.
And I think in a single neighborhood over a period of 5 years or so, I think it was like 20% of all the males between 25 and 29, 20% have been incarcerated.
Yeah, and that gets to the point about, is there a stigma attached to incarceration? If that's gone, then we've wasted the power of that in medicine in a way. And then there's a whole other literature about why it's not good to have mass incarceration in a neighborhood. When you're moving people in and out of prison all the time, you're disrupting social relationships. And social relationships are the very thing that neighbors depend on to keep their community safe. If you don't know the guy next door, you're less likely to talk to them about a problem. So we really want to repair the fabric of our urban neighborhoods. And I think, there's a lot of components to that. A lot of it has to do with not racial discrimination in the justice system, but racial discrimination in employment, and in housing and other things. So, obviously there's a lot to talk about here, but we do know that we can do better than we're doing in our prisons and jails. I think everybody agrees on that, and it's about having the resolve to find the solutions.
I know Suffolk County Sheriff Steve Tompkins has talked about doing things to keep people from having to come back, but what else needs to be done?
Yeah, I think the sheriff is working on that. The police commissioner, I think, the Boston Police Department has been exceptional. I think they're really thinking about, does this person need to go to prison? Is there another pathway for them? Especially if it's a substance abuse and mental health issue where they don't belong there, they shouldn't have the mark of the criminal record, it's really a health issue. But it comes down to resources, right? We're spending a fortune to take people from these communities and put them in a cell. Could we redeploy that money in the community in ways where we can work with people, give youth opportunities, provide solutions for youth who seem like they may be off course, and prevent the victimization and the cost of incarceration.
We're talking with Ben Forman from MassINC. Ben, when I look especially at the Franklin Field map, I see you have two public housing developments there, which means that there must be a lot of persistent poverty we're talking about that overlaps with this.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that there's a connection between opportunity and crime in places. And I think if people don't feel like there's a place for them to contribute in a productive way for them to engage, especially young people. I think a lot of it starts with young people where they go off course. And all young people go off course. I know I did, and yes. Certainly every friend I had did, right? But people found a way to bring us back on board, and I think families that are fractured and communities that are fractured have a much more difficult time supporting all their youth. And so what we see is a lot of youth in prison, a lot of young people in prison, and putting people in prison in that juncture really disrupts them. And it makes them more criminogenic. It makes them more likely to continue to commit more crime and more crime, more crime. And that's the pattern we see. There's nobody in jail who didn't wind up in jail when they were in this young adult stage. When we look at these communities that have the highest incarceration rates, they typically have a higher percentage of the people who are incarcerated in that young age. And I think one of the things the sheriff and others are working on is figuring out, jail's no place for these young people to be. Is there another option? They may be doing things that are very dangerous, and the community should be deeply concerned about that. But we've got to be equally thoughtful about how the choice we make at that stage doesn't make them even more dangerous and a lifelong career criminal, which unfortunately happens.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you again, Chris. Appreciate it.
Ben Forman from MassINC. Still to come, a chance for riders to affect plans for late night service by the MBTA.